had to add this in because for some reason I found this article and literally read it this morning on the train up here, had to add a comment or two about it because I thought it was so dope and deep. So I said, dope and deep. In an article by, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, in an article by Arthur Asaraf, Mass Media and the Colonial Informant. It's fascinating. Written in 2021. The story of the simultaneous rise of both colonialism and mass media and the particular role that could be played by the intermediary, the mediating informant, the colonial go-between, translating the mandates of the ruling elite in ways acceptable to both those who rule and those to be ruled, and of course, benefiting in the process. In this case, the protagonist was the anti-Kendrick Lamar performing in his Cash App commercial, intentionally misreporting the facts of the Algerian colonies back to French authorities. This fascinating true story, it is Djebari, if I'm saying his name correctly, who created in the late 19th century and actually played a role participating, which led to a fascinating section of this article about the role North Africans played in the European colonial process of the so-called scramble for Africa. Fascinating. But its point is that we are, through a process of colonialism, encouraged in ways to become the mediating conduits through which our oppression is explained to our communities, justified, resisted safely. This article analyzes the art of making yourself into a conduit in the modern information. The simultaneous expansions of colonialism and mass media generated an environment where information had to appear depersonalized to be taken seriously, and yet where only certain individuals could have access to particular kinds of knowledge. This encouraged a practice of passing off one's own fictions as somebody else's information, especially for colonized subjects. So it's a fast. So what I meant by the Cash App reference is that this is that brilliant commercial that came out some years ago that shows what the colonial process is. It showed it. It starts off with the brother. You just see some brother on screen, and he's using the typical AAVE speech. You know, brother, I got, some investment, and I drop some money in the thing, and then I try to flip it when, and the camera pulls back, and you see he's talking to Kendrick. And Kendrick is listening. And then he says, all right. And then he starts to take what the brother says to him in turns, and he starts distilling that. And well, what he's actually saying is, and then he pulls back, you see he's talking to this white businessman. And then the white businessman hears what Kendrick is saying, and he says, oh, no, what you need to tell your buddy is that he should have done this, that, and the third. And then Kendrick says, oh, okay. And he turns, he says, nah, I see what you need to do is flip, and then it's a Cash App commercial. And I said, this is the dopest commercial ever. This is the most explanatory, reveal, confession of a commercial I've ever seen. Kendrick playing the colonial informant. Now, I know he's everybody's hero right now, but I'm just saying. So this is why I've argued, and some of my comrades have evolved this concept, the Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance as a stepping stone, a bridge to political anger that is described brilliantly in Blood in My Eye. And as I try to put in the note here, the anger should be the blood in all of our eyes. We should all become Georges. We need the George Jackson political party and overt, militant, explicit attempts to achieve political power. So the Vernon philosophy is just an argument, long story short, that no oppressed group should ever look to see itself represented in media targeting them as part of their colonial process. And the more we like it, the more we should resist it. Be critical of it. Ask, how did they find that colonial informant that's gonna change this story into something that's gonna work for me? How did they get me? Yeah. Yeah. And then you got to work in collectives because you can't do this by yourself. You will not. And then that's why George said we need three things. The army, the secret army, come on now. I'm not doing that. I'm about to sit down and then about to sit down. I'm not doing that. We need an underground press. an alternative press that would help popularize the radical movements we need to be part of. And then, of course, we need a militant, aggressive way to engage the electoral political process. And that part we need to be working on more and more aggressively every day. The article is Mass Media and the Colonial Informant, Messaoud Djebari and the French Empire, 1880 to 1901 by Arthur Asseroff, in Past and Present, Volume 254, Issue 1, February 2022. I loved this article, and I'm going to make a lot of use of it. I'll just read the opening paragraph and then go through some of the highlights, and then encourage. On 20 September 1895, a large crowd filed into Grand Hotel in Paris, just opposite of the opera, to hear a talk by an Algerian man. Messaoud Djebari, born near Bonn, and forgive me for all the mispronunciations, on the Mediterranean, held their attention with stories about his recent expedition to West Africa. Returning from Dahomey in Nigeria, he claimed to have found the survivors of the Flatters mission, a French expedition that had been massacred in the Sahara in 1881. The Parisian public were thrilled with the possibility that members of the mission might still be alive in darkest Africa over 10 years later. His spectacular yet unverifiable claims confused the public and experts, and the reunion in Paris ended in disarray. Prominent men formed a committee to investigate his assertions. The next day, reports of this meeting splashed the pages of most Parisian newspapers. This was a subject that captivates the entire press. What this article ends up talking about is the way that colonialism created a situation, among many others, obviously, where a colonized Algerian North African could find his way through his own skill set and interests to become a colonial intermediary, the colonial informant. Djebari was accomplished in the art of generating information that was both plausible yet unverifiable. That he came into to adulthood at a time where a new mass media in terms of a printed press was just evolving, where the Western European powers were further expanding into the continent of Africa and on their way to the so-called Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa, the great cake to be carved up. And I think he points to a role that continues to be played to this day, where particularly in commercial, well-platformed and supported, even state-sponsored media, members of the colonized community are invited to play the go-between. I think it happens in pop culture. I think it happens in politics. I think it happens even in terms of the self-snitching going on in podcasts, getting members of street organizations caught up in all kinds of cases. And this is not to say that these are innocent people that should be happily running the streets, but it's the mediated spaces that they're entering, often controlled by the settler colonial community, where they're performing this informant duty that we read about in this article, where the preferred narratives coming out of the colonized spaces that elite whites can't engage is sort of concretized. I don't know. It's fascinating. So, okay, as a North African Muslim colonial subject, Djebari could not hope to gain attention in his own right. However, he could portray himself as a conduit between a European audience and the worlds that they had no access to, especially sub-Saharan Africans who were further below him in the imagined racial order. Thus, to gain attention, Djebari portrayed himself as a mere intermediary. He consistently passed off his own opinions and fictions as somebody else's information. This article analyzes the art of making yourself into a conduit in the modern information system. Oh, the simultaneous expansions of colonialism and mass media generated an environment where information had to appear depersonalized to be taken seriously, and yet where only certain individuals could have access to particular kinds of knowledge. This encouraged a practice of passing off one's own fictions as somebody else's information, especially for colonized subjects like Djebari. The 19th century saw the emergence of an integrated transcontinental news system based on the electric telegraph dominated by Europeans and North Americans. Information flows became faster, more technologically complex, and more concentrated in the hands of the few who had huge power to broadcast to many. Does that sound familiar? because all that has happened since is an increase in the sophistication of that technology, and this exact problem is worse today. And please don't be confused as we read through this when they're talking about how, yes, in the 19th century, white Parisians could not so easily click something and find out what was actually happening in Senegal. But please don't think that by today's world existing in with this internet, that I don't think I did enough service. You know what? Did I show the right clip, or did I show the clip properly when I showed the millennials are killing capitalism clip earlier? Because one of the points I was trying to make was that that they were showing was that the internet was born out of ARPANET, military technology, and used by the military strategists of the day, as is today, as a method of counterinsurgency. So the idea that simply because we live in an advanced technological media environment that this problem being identified right here wouldn't exist is pure fantasy, because the images that people have of so-called foreign lands, even in this highly digitized environment, is still itself manicured by and with dominant narratives imposed by an even more concentrated, powerful, and wealthy ownership of people with of media that has even more penetrative capacity than at the time being described here. So yes, people could theoretically see more of the so-called foreign world or global south than they could at the time of the 19th century, but that does not mean that they're getting an accurate version, and it does not mean that it's not being mediated in many of the same kinds of ways through performance and false projection of the colonial experience from those who appear to be from the colonized themselves. Djebari was an interpreter for the French army in North Africa who ended up producing unreliable information and generating huge problems for the authorities. In the 19th century, European powers tried to rule new colonial empires relying on a small number of administrators stretched thinly across Africa and Asia. To do so, they relied on informants who frequently gamed the intelligence system to their own advantage. Obviously, not enough to free themselves, but much like what we see today, colonial informants can definitely individually benefit by creating distorted messages that might even at times confuse authorities. But as is the case here, without it even being said, obviously British colonialism was not brought down by this, but it's that British colonialism in this case, or colonialism in general, created the informant that even at times does give misinformation to their own personal benefit, but certainly not in any meaningful way that upsets the overall imperial process. To put it differently, what does one do with the rogue Algerian interpreter dominating the pages of the Parisian press in the middle of the Dreyfus affair? Dreyfus affair was, of course, one of the famous incidents where a Jewish military, I think, officer was because of being a Jew, was punished by French authorities and blamed for something he did not do, punished, I think, in a prison camp for 5 or 6 years, something like that. Uh, but anyway, this requires analyzing colonialism as a truly global phenomenon that was not restricted to colonial territories. Rather than a face-to-face between the metropole and the colony, Djebari's trajectory sketches a triangle between the Maghreb, Europe, and West Africa. Uh, Informants defined by their ability to portray themselves as conduits to valuable information inaccessible to Europeans. So again, I'm even thinking of it in terms of this trifling stuff happening with all these street organizations. They go on these, it's and even the clip that maybe we'll even get to, that I wanted to show, where a desire by segments of the white community to have proximity to the colonized creates this desire for the colonial informant to emerge. Tell us the stories, oh gangster. Oh, tell us the story of your black world. And then, yeah, if you make up a couple things, embellish a couple things, give a whoop, 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 give a couple stories that they want to hear, whoop, 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 you might make a couple dollars. You might even, get your op locked up. And one of the points that it does raise is that, Djebari was apparently, well, maybe we'll get to it in a minute. Djebari was an avid reader of newspapers written by and for a European audience. as a native, he could only be a reader of these newspapers and not legitimately participate in their world of political debates for citizen journalists. His political activity had to be indirect, capturing the attention of Frenchmen in power by offering them information on the activities of others. This practice would lead him to get involved in the affairs beyond his native Algeria, well beyond his native Algeria. So it does talk about Djebari, like with many of us, there's a desire for attention, for recognition, for to improve the station that is imposed upon us, and many will find ways to at least appear to give those in power what they want to get some sort of advance from it. And if you can't participate legitimately, you can't sit down at the table, you can't get it to the press, in the same way. You come up with these alternatives. Djebari was not a nationalist and he did not advocate for Algerian independence, but he was a passionate advocate for equality. So they talk about that he would find ways to get things published in the local press that talked about why were the French not applying to the Algerians the same level of democracy and freedom and equality that they claimed, that they said that they had for themselves. So it was like that sort of what we see nowadays. It's like, I'm not opposed to you. I'm not anti-colonial. I just want you to be the democracy you said you would be. Feeding off of colonial fears, Djebari concocted the exact dish the authorities were expecting, a conspiracy of almost all the notables of Eastern Algeria with Tunisian authorities and worse with Italians. That's the other thing. It gets into some interesting bits of history in terms of the relationship between the French and the Italians and competing colonialisms and the way French colonialism was trying to manage itself in one part of its empire versus another, and Djebari playing off of that to get himself into certain spaces to be heard. By emphasizing his position as an Algerian Muslim, Djebari was able to play a significant role in the scramble for Africa. This was a fascinating part of the article too. French expansion in West Africa offered opportunities to escape the stifling restrictions of settler rule in North Africa, in which they could hope to ascend the racial hierarchy by becoming white agents of the French Empire among the uncivilized blacks. So he said, hey, I'm a Muslim. I'm an Arab. I'm an Algerian. I'm with the French. I'm not with these black folks. And he went along with the French expedition into conquering Africa. Recent scholarship has begun to recognize that North Africans played important roles in the scramble for Africa, which was not just a process of European expansion. As Mustafa Minawi points out, area studies logics have often obscured the important contemporary links in the turn of the 20th century between the Middle East and Africa, so-called. Yeah, it's interesting. Djebari positioned himself as a white explorer, describing the Yoruba as very savage and in dire need of missionary attention, for the instrument of civilization par excellence is religion. While Islamic notions of race had their own distinctive history, in this case, they could agree with the European views that sub-Saharan black populations were savage and should be brought into progress by monotheistic religion. Again, I know it's often preferred we ignore it, but of course this was the case. And of course, the 19th century, the 1800s, was a good 1,000 years after Arabs and Islam spread, engaged the African continent. And I stood I visited in East Africa, one of those slave cave pits where Islam was interacting with Africans. So yeah, of course there was a racial hierarchy in that world. The Zanj Rebellion didn't happen because Africans were having a great time. I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.